Snow had not yet fallen that year, but the wind had already learned the taste of winter. It moved through the town of Dry Creek like a whisper too tired to carry words, bending the lantern flames that lined the sheriff's yard. It was hiring day again, the county hiring fair, where men came to choose cooks' hands and housemaids before the snows locked the valley shut. Steam rose from the iron pots at the food stall, horses pawed at frozen dirt, and laughter floated through the air like smoke. Elias Grant sat tall on his horse at the edge of the gathering, a quiet monument among noise. At 34, he was already a legend of sorts, the giant rancher who owned half the valley, who rode alone through blizzards, who never smiled. Broad shoulders, a face carved by sun and wind, and eyes that rarely lifted long enough to meet another's. Some said he was cold. Others said he was lonely. Both were true, though no one dared say it to his face. The sheriff spotted him through the crowd and grinned, voice booming across the yard. "Grant, the richest man in the county. Come on now, choose yourself a cook. Any woman here'd trade her apron for your gold." Laughter broke like glass on the wind. Elias didn't laugh. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the pale dust. His gaze swept the line of women standing nervously by the corral fence, some young, some worn, all waiting to be chosen like cattle. Near the end of the line stood a woman apart from the others. Her dress was clean but threadbare, her dark hair braided simply, her hands folded at her waist as if in prayer. Her name was Nita, though few in town bothered to remember it. An Apache woman, heavy in build, with a softness that the world mistook for shame. Her eyes held something ancient, like river stones polished by years of endurance. The butcher's wife whispered, "That one again? The fat one? She burnt my bread last spring." Someone else laughed. "Maybe she'll cook for the dogs this year." Nita heard them. She always did. She'd come because work meant food, and food meant her old mother wouldn't starve through winter. Still, humiliation never dulled completely. It only learned to hide. She fixed her gaze on the ground, heart thudding like a drum in a canyon. The sheriff puffed his chest, enjoying his moment. "Come on, Elias. Any cook you want. They'll line up for you." Elias said nothing. He walked the line slowly, boots crunching, eyes unreadable. The women shifted, hopeful. When he stopped in front of Nita, the laughter behind him faltered. For a long breath, he simply looked at her. Not up or down, just level, steady, as if weighing the worth of something sacred. The sheriff cleared his throat, uneasy. "You sure you're in the right row, Grant? That one, well, she's—" Elias's voice cut through like distant thunder. "Then I'll marry the one no one else would choose." The words seemed to still even the wind. Nita lifted her head, startled. Around them came bursts of nervous laughter, some mocking, some confused. The sheriff blinked. "You mean hire her, not—" "I said marry," Elias repeated. Someone whistled. Another spat in disbelief. The crowd began to murmur, half scandal, half entertainment. But Elias didn't move, didn't flinch. He extended his hand toward Nita. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Years of rejection had taught her to doubt kindness. But there was no jest in his eyes, only a quiet sort of gravity, like a man long accustomed to loneliness recognizing its twin. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, and the murmurs behind them faded into a dull hum. They walked away together through the thinning light, the sheriff watching with an open mouth. Snowflakes finally began to fall, just a few, scattered like shy blessings. The road out of town stretched gray and silent. Nita's heart pounded with questions she couldn't ask. Why her? Why now? Was it pity or something stranger? She risked a glance at him. His expression was unreadable, eyes fixed on the horizon where dusk was spilling its last colors over the hills. When they reached the ranch, the sun had vanished. The house loomed large, windows glowing faintly from the fire inside. She followed him through the doorway, clutching her shawl as if to hide behind it. The air smelled of cedar and loneliness. He motioned toward the kitchen. "You'll find what you need there," he said quietly. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." It was the first time anyone had ever offered her food without expecting work first. She nodded, unsure what to say. He paused at the doorway before leaving her alone by the fire. "You don't have to be afraid," he added. "I don't like noise. That's all." And then he was gone, boots fading down the hall. Nita stood in the silence, unsure whether to cry or laugh. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the shutters. She ladled a bit of stew into a bowl, her hands still shaking. It tasted plain, lonely, like the house itself. She moved quietly, tidying what she could, feeding the embers until they glowed warm and steady. As she worked, she began to hum, softly at first, then stronger, a melody her mother used to sing while grinding corn. The song filled the room like light through a crack in old wood. Upstairs, Elias paused. He hadn't heard singing in this house for years. Something inside him, something long locked away, stirred awake. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening. The sound wasn't beautiful in the way of trained voices. It was rough and real, carrying the weight of someone who had survived too much and still found gentleness. When the last note faded, he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Downstairs, Nita blew out the lamp and sat beside the dying fire. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes fixed on the flames. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, mockery, silence, maybe regret. But for the first time in a long time, someone had chosen her. Not as help, not as burden, but as a human being. Outside, the wind shifted again, colder now. The ranch stood alone in the valley, its windows flickering like watchful eyes. And somewhere between the last ember and the falling snow, two strangers, one burdened by pride, the other by shame, felt the faint tremor of something beginning. Morning came like a slow confession, pale light spilling through the frost-glazed windows of the Grant Ranch. Nita rose before the rooster's cry, moving through the kitchen with quiet purpose. The house breathed differently now, less hollow, though she barely dared to believe she'd had any hand in that. She stirred coffee over the fire, the aroma winding through the hallways like a thread searching for something to bind. Upstairs, Elias woke to it, the sound of her humming drifting up the staircase. He'd lived years without music, yet now silence felt incomplete. When he came down, his boots heavy on the wooden steps, she didn't greet him with words, just a gentle nod and a steaming mug. He took it, the warmth biting pleasantly against his cold hands. Their eyes met briefly. It wasn't affection yet, but recognition, a shared understanding that both were learning how to exist beside someone else again. Outside, the valley lay wrapped in thin mist. He saddled his horse for the day's work and found her by the door, waiting with a small cloth bundle. "For lunch," she murmured, not meeting his gaze. Inside it were biscuits and jerky, wrapped neat as a prayer. He hesitated, touched in a way he couldn't name. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt new in his mouth. In town, gossip thickened like mud after rain. The rancher and his fat Apache wife. Men laughed over their ale. Women whispered over flour sacks. Some said he married her out of pity, others out of madness. Elias heard snatches of it when he came in for supplies. He never answered. He had learned long ago that silence was stronger than fists. Still, each word left its mark. When he returned home that evening, he found Nita sitting on the back steps, her shawl drawn tight, her basket half empty. She had walked to town earlier, hoping to buy sugar and flour, but the shopkeeper refused her coin. He'd said he didn't sell to people like her. She had come home wordless, her dignity folded like paper in her hands. Elias saw the tremor in her shoulders and felt something twist inside him, a sharp anger he rarely let surface. He took the basket from her quietly. "Stay here," he said, his voice like gravel breaking. Before she could answer, he rode off into the night. In Dry Creek, lanterns were dimming when his horse thundered down the street. He stopped in front of the general store, dismounted, and walked inside. The shopkeeper looked up, startled. Elias set the basket on the counter, the coins clinking like thunder. "You forgot her change," he said evenly. The man stammered something about policy, about customers, but Elias's eyes silenced him. He left without another word, the basket full again, pride returned like a gift. When he reached home, Nita was waiting by the gate, snowflakes melting in her hair. He handed her the basket. "They'll take your coin from now on," he said simply. She opened her mouth to thank him, but found no words strong enough. He turned to lead his horse away, but she reached out, just a touch on his sleeve, brief, trembling, real. For him, it felt like forgiveness he hadn't earned. Days slipped into weeks. Slowly, the rhythm of their lives intertwined. She began to plant herbs behind the kitchen, rosemary, wild mint, sage she'd found by the creek. He repaired the fence by her garden, watching her kneel in the soil, her laughter startling the crows. When she cooked, he lingered near the doorway, listening to her tell old stories under her breath, tales of the desert winds, of her grandmother's campfires. He didn't always understand the words, but he understood the feeling. It was home. The ranch hands noticed the change first. Old Tommy, who'd worked for Elias since his youth, whispered to the blacksmith one evening, "Boss don't scowl no more. Even the horses act calmer." They laughed, but it was true. Elias had begun to speak softer, his silences no longer heavy with sorrow. One night, a winter storm rolled in sudden and fierce. The wind howled like a wounded thing, battering the shutters. Nita rushed to secure the kitchen window, and Elias joined her, his large hands covering hers on the latch. For a moment, they stood pressed close, their breath mingling in the cold air. The storm outside roared, yet inside, a different stillness bloomed. When the latch held, she turned to thank him, and for the first time, their smiles met. Afterward, they sat by the hearth while the storm raged. She mended his torn coat, the needle flashing in the firelight. He watched her hands, steady, capable, beautiful despite the scars. "You could have chosen anyone," she said softly, not looking up. "Why me?" He stared into the flames. "Because you didn't flinch when I looked at you," he said after a long silence. "Everyone else did." Her needle paused midair. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. She wanted to believe him, but doubt was a habit hard to break. "People talk," she whispered. "They say you married me to prove something." He met her eyes. "Maybe I did," he admitted. "But now I'm proving it to myself." The wind eased, snow beginning to fall in fat, quiet flakes. She finished stitching the coat and laid it across his lap. Neither spoke again, but the air between them had changed. As spring drew near, sunlight returned to the valley, softening the edges of everything. The river swelled, wildflowers crept along the fences, and laughter began to visit the ranch like a new tenant. Nita baked bread that filled the air with comfort, and Elias spent his evenings on the porch, listening to her hum while the sun dyed gold behind the hills. Yet beyond their quiet world, the town prepared for its annual spring fair, a day of contests, music, and mischief. The sheriff himself stopped by one afternoon, grinning wide. "We're hosting a cook-off this year," he told Elias, slapping his shoulder. "Tell your lady to join. Folks could use a taste of her. Apache spices." His tone was playful, but the glint in his eyes was not kind. Nita heard from the kitchen, her heart tightening. She knew what it meant, a spectacle disguised as invitation. Elias started to refuse, but she stepped forward before he could speak. "I'll come," she said quietly. The sheriff raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Good. The town loves a good show." When he left, Elias turned to her. "You don't have to do this." She wiped her hands on her apron, meeting his gaze with calm resolve. "I've hidden long enough," she said. "Let them taste what they mock." For a moment, pride flickered in his eyes, bright, protective, admiring. The wind outside carried the scent of thawing earth and distant rain. Somewhere deep within both of them, the echo of old pain shifted, making room for something braver. And as dusk fell over the ranch, Nita stood by the window, watching the horizon glow red, unaware that the coming fair would not only test her courage, but also decide the shape of their hearts forever. Morning came bright and sharp, the kind of light that makes the whole valley shimmer, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Dry Creek buzzed with anticipation. Stalls lined the square, ribbons fluttered, the air thick with a mingled sense of roasted corn, saddle leather, and fresh-baked bread. It was the day of the spring fair. For most, it meant laughter and music. For Nita, it meant standing before those who had long whispered her name like an insult. She woke before dawn, braiding her dark hair with deliberate care, pinning a small turquoise bead at the end, the only heirloom from her mother. Her hands didn't tremble, though her stomach coiled like a knotted rope. Elias stood in the doorway, his broad frame filling the morning light. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked quietly. She turned, her gaze steady. "I'm not doing it for them," she said. "I'm doing it for me." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Then I'll be there." By mid-morning, the fairgrounds swelled with people. Children ran between booths, the brass band blared uneven tunes, and the sheriff strutted like a man who owned the sun. At the center stood the long cooking table, already surrounded by women in crisp dresses and polished smiles. Flour dust floated through the air like ghostly confetti. When Nita approached, conversation faltered. Some laughed under their breath. The sheriff smirked. "Well, if it isn't the rancher's bride," he drawled. "Hope you brought something that ain't too spicy for civilized tongues." She met his eyes without flinching. Civilized tongues forget what real food tastes like. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Elias, standing near the corral fence, bit back a grin. There it was, the spark he'd glimpsed beneath her quietness, the fire she'd hidden from the world. The contest began with the clang of a spoon against a pot. Fires were lit, ingredients laid out. The women bustled and bragged, but Nita worked in silence, her movements fluid, almost reverent. She cooked as her ancestors had, slow and patient, letting the ingredients speak. Dried chilies soaked in warm broth, onions caramelized until golden, cornmeal thickened into soft cakes. The scent rose, rich and alive, curling through the fair like a promise. Whispers began to fade. Even those who had come to mock found themselves watching her hands, mesmerized by their grace. The sheriff's wife burned her gravy in distraction. Another contestant spilled her stew. But Nita kept her rhythm steady, her heart tuned to memory, the rhythm of her mother's song, the echo of laughter around forgotten fires. Elias watched her from across the square, a strange ache in his chest. He'd thought himself beyond surprises, beyond tenderness. Yet as the smoke curled around her face and sunlight caught the copper of her skin, he realized he wasn't watching her cook. He was watching her belong. When the dishes were finally presented, the sheriff strutted forward with theatrical flair. He tasted each one, exaggerating his smacks and sighs for the crowd. The laughter swelled again, until he reached Nita's bowl. He took one spoonful, paused. Then another. His face changed. The performance drained from his eyes. "What's in this?" he asked, voice quiet now. "Corn, beans, chilies," she said. "And thyme." He looked at her for a long moment, then turned to the crowd. "Tastes like home," he said, the word catching. The crowd fell silent, the air shifting from mockery to something hushed, uncertain. But the stillness shattered when a drunk voice called from the back, slurred with bitterness. "Don't be fooled. She's Apache, feeding poison to good folks." The words sliced the moment open. A few laughed nervously. Others looked away. Nita froze, color draining from her cheeks. Before anyone could move, Elias stepped forward. His voice rolled through the square like thunder over dry earth. "That's enough." The crowd parted instinctively. He stood beside her, tall and unyielding. "You all talk about decency," he said, eyes sweeping the faces he'd known all his life, "but you've forgotten what it looks like. She's fed every soul in this town with her kindness, and you've starved her with your scorn." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, but Elias didn't stop. "You asked me once to choose any cook I wanted," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I did. I chose the only one with a heart big enough to forgive this town for its cruelty." Nita's eyes filled, the tears shimmering like frost beneath sunlight. He turned to her, his voice softening. "I didn't marry you out of pity, Nita. I married you because I saw the courage everyone else was too small to see." The silence that followed was immense. Then, slowly, someone clapped. Tommy, the old ranch hand, his weathered face wet with tears. Another joined, then another, until the whole square echoed with applause that felt less like celebration and more like confession. Nita stood trembling, her heart a wild drum. The sheriff tried to speak, but his words drowned in the sound of hands meeting hands. She looked up at Elias, And in his eyes she saw what she'd never dared dream, pride, not pity. The fair ended with laughter, not cruel this time, but warm. Children asked for seconds of her stew. Women approached to ask for her recipe. The world had not changed entirely, but something had cracked open, and through it, light poured. That night, they rode home in silence, the sky streaked with dying gold. The air smelled of rain and wild sage. She leaned against him on the saddle, exhaustion melting into peace. At the ranch, he helped her down and didn't let go of her hand. Inside, the fire flickered low. He poured her tea, then sat beside her. For a long while, neither spoke. Then he said almost shyly, "You won today." She smiled faintly. "We both did." Outside, the storm that had threatened all day finally broke, a soft rain, gentle as forgiveness. It tapped the roof like a lullaby. Elias looked at her, his voice barely more than breath. "You turned my house into a home." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "And you gave me a place to belong." Their hands stayed entwined, quiet and sure, while the rain whispered against the windows. Beyond the glass, lightning flickered across the valley, illuminating the ranch like a beacon. And for the first time in Dry Creek's long, bitter history, the night smelled not of smoke or dust, but of something new being born, something tender and enduring, like love learning to breathe.